I'm not cold. I've simply stepped back into my own light and stopped handing it to those who mistook it for a free fire to burn through. I don't abandon people. I abandon patterns, and the pattern was this. They fed on my warmth and called it connection. There was a time I made myself available to every ache that knocked on my door. I was the soft place, the healer, the open flame, even when their words cut, even when their shadows spread. I stayed open, and they called that love. But it wasn't love. It was survival, an inherited wound that taught me to be useful before I was allowed to be whole. I became the giver, the one who absorbed the damage, the mirror, the mask, the feather, holding the weight of a world that was never mine. I gave my light without asking who was taking it. I thought that made me strong, but now I know. It made me invisible. So yes, I've changed. And no, I don't explain anymore, because there's a version of me, still curled at the center of a storm, still bleeding kindness from an open chest. And I swore I'd never let him suffer for my silence again. Now I listen more than I explain. I walk away more than I plead. I sit in stillness and let the noise pass like weather. They call it cold. I call it knowing the worth of my own energy. I no longer give explanations to those who only listen to respond. I no longer soften my truth to be palatable to people who never learned how to hold it. Because clarity can feel like cruelty to those who were comforted by your confusion. There was a time I let their guilt shape my decisions, let their chaos walk freely through my spirit, while I called it compassion. But guilt is not guidance, and chaos is not intimacy. Now I protect my silence like sacred ground. I protect my heart like it's still being stitched shut by trembling hands. Because I remember that boy, the younger version of me, kneeling in the dark, offering bits of his glow to shadows that never stayed, calling it love, calling it duty, calling it enough. But enough was never enough. Not when the ones who take never remember the weight it costs to give. So if I seem distant now, understand, I am not hiding. I am healing. Not behind walls, but behind wisdom. I no longer open the gates to every knock. I no longer bleed to prove I still feel. I protect my peace more than I prove my point. Because peace is not something I ever inherited. I had to build it. From silence, from solitude, from the ruins of who I used to be. They say I've grown distant, but they never ask what it took to become close to myself again. I no longer chase understanding from those committed to misunderstanding me. I no longer argue where I am not truly heard. I no longer perform warmth just to keep the room from feeling cold. You call it distance, I call it return. You call it cold, I call it healed. Because warmth, when given without limit, becomes the fire they expect you to burn in. So now, I sit in the center of my stillness and let the storms pass without entering me. I choose where my light goes, not out of bitterness, but discernment. Not out of pride, but peace. And still, there are those who only remember the version of me who bled light on command, who gave without boundary, who remained reachable even when I was breaking. To them, this version of me will feel unfamiliar, and that's okay, because healing doesn't always look like light pouring in. Sometimes it looks like drawing your light inward, like a tide reclaiming itself after years of erosion. There are no apologies in my solitude, no guilt in my absence. I do not grieve the masks I laid down. I do not mourn the weight I stopped carrying. That was never love. That was performance. That was survival, painted to look like devotion. Now I choose rest over reaction, silence over explanation, distance over disrespect. And there is power in that stillness, a power they mistook for emptiness, only because they were never still enough to understand it. The ones who say I've changed are right. I no longer orbit their needs. I no longer betray my peace to maintain a connection built on my depletion. I used to flinch at the word cold. Now I see it for what it is. A projection from those who only called me warm when I was burning myself alive to keep them comfortable. But I have extinguished that fire, and in its place, stillness, sacred, rooted, mine. Let them call it cold. Let them call it distant. I know what it truly is. It's freedom. It's clarity. It's what happens when the soul stops begging for permission to protect itself. You do not owe warmth to those who only show up when they're cold. You do not owe your light to those who cannot sit with your shadow. You owe yourself peace. You owe yourself return. You owe yourself the right to be whole, even if it means being misunderstood. And me, I am not cold. I am clear. I am calm. I am finally in charge of my own emotional weather. And nothing moves me the way it used to.